August 18, 1943, 200 feet above the Bismarck Sea. A B-25, Mitchell streams fire from its left engine nacelle, fuel burning bright against the tropical morning. The target airfield lies 4 miles ahead. Flak bursts walk across the water. Japanese fighters circle above like vultures waiting for the wounded to fall. The pilot has altitude to bail, speed to climb. Neither option exists in his mind. The mathematics of survival have already failed. The fire changed everything in the span of 3 heartbeats. One moment, the B-25 was a weapon in controlled flight, nose low, airspeed building past 230 miles per hour. The water below a green-gray blur, streaked with whitecaps. The next moment, orange flame erupted from the cowling of the left-right cyclone, fed by fuel or hydraulic fluid or both, the source impossible to identify at speed and under fire. The aircraft was a North American B-25D Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber redesignated for a mission its designers had never fully anticipated. This particular variant had been modified in theater, its bombardier station replaced with a solid nose packed with forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. The bomb bay carried parafrag clusters and small demolition bombs. The mission profile demanded delivery at altitudes measured in tens of feet, not thousands. At these heights, there was no margin for mechanical failure, no time for troubleshooting, no altitude to trade for options. Fire in a B-25 was not an abstraction. The aircraft carried nearly 1,000 gallons of aviation fuel distributed across wing tanks and auxiliary cells. The engines ran hot under full combat power. Fuel lines snaked through the nacelles and wing roots, and any breach meant atomized gasoline meeting superheated metal. The Wright R-2600 radials operated at cylinder head temperatures that could exceed 400 degrees Fahrenheit under sustained load. A fuel-fed fire at those temperatures did not smolder. It consumed. The burning Mitchell held formation. This was the first anomaly the pilots behind it noticed. A stricken aircraft at this altitude and speed should have pitched up, trading velocity for distance from the threat, buying seconds for the crew to prepare for bailout or ditching. Instead, the lead B-25 maintained its attack heading, nose pointed toward the collection of revetments and runways that comprised the Japanese airfield complex at Dagwa, one of the most heavily defended positions in the Southwest Pacific. The formation itself was flying in a combat box, modified for low-altitude strafing. Aircraft staggered laterally and vertically by mere feet, each pilot responsible for maintaining position relative to the leader. In this configuration, the lead aircraft was not merely first in line. It was the aiming reference, the timing marker, the visual anchor that told every following pilot when to begin their run, when to release ordnance, when to break away. If the leader deviated, the formation fragmented. If the leader aborted, the attack dissolved into individual aircraft, making individual decisions against a consolidated defense. The defense over Dagwa that morning was anything but theoretical. Japanese Army Air Force units had concentrated fighters at the WWII complex specifically to contest Allied air operations. Intelligence briefings before the mission had estimated dozens of operational fighters dispersed among the 4 airfields in the area. Anti-aircraft positions ringed the strips with automatic weapons, and heavier guns zeroed on the approaches. The low-altitude attack profile that made the B-25s lethal against parked aircraft also delivered them directly into the engagement envelope of every defensive weapon on the ground. And now the lead aircraft was burning. Smoke trailed behind the Mitchell in a thick gray-black plume, marking its position for every Japanese gunner and fighter pilot within visual range. The fire itself was concentrated on the left nacelle, the flames streaming backward along the wing root, licking at the fuselage skin. Inside that wing, fuel remained. How much and how long before the fire found it were questions without comfortable answers. The pilot of the burning B-25 had approximately 90 seconds of flight time remaining before reaching the target area. 90 seconds to choose between personal survival and mission execution. At 230 miles per hour, that translated to roughly 5.5 miles of airspace, 5.5 miles of level flight through flak and fighter opposition in an aircraft actively trying to immolate itself. Any training manual would have prescribed immediate action. Throttle back the affected engine, feather the propeller to reduce drag, activate the fire extinguisher system if fuel permitted. If the fire could not be contained, gain altitude and prepare for bailout or controlled ditching. Under no circumstances continue an attack run in a burning aircraft through defended airspace with fighters overhead. The Mitchell did not climb, the Mitchell did not turn. The Mitchell held its heading and its airspeed, leading 12 other aircraft toward the most dangerous stretch of sky in New Guinea. The pilot had made a decision that existed outside doctrine, outside training, outside the careful calculations of survival that kept most men alive in combat. The aircraft was committed, the formation was committed, and, somewhere in the mind of the man at the controls, the mission had become more important than the fire consuming his machine. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Ralph Cheli grew up in San Francisco in the 1920s, the son of Italian immigrants who had crossed an ocean seeking the kind of stability that war would later deny their children. The city of his youth was a place of fog and hills, of clattering streetcars and fishing boats crowding the wharves, a world utterly removed from the tropical violence that would define his legacy. He was not a remarkable child in the ways that later narratives often require. No early fascination with flight fills the historical record. No boyhood obsession with aircraft or engines distinguishes him from his peers. What does emerge from the fragmentary accounts of those who knew him is a pattern of quiet competence, a tendency to take responsibility without seeking recognition, the kind of steady presence that teachers remember decades later without being able to articulate exactly why. Cheli attended San Francisco's public schools during the Depression years, graduating high school as the economy finally began its slow recovery. He enrolled at San Francisco Junior College, then transferred to what would become San Jose State, studying business administration. The choice was practical rather than passionate. In the late 1930s, a business degree promised stability in a world that had offered precious little of it. Aviation entered his life through the Civilian Pilot Training Program, one of the Roosevelt administration's initiatives to build a reserve of trained pilots against the increasingly likely prospect of war. The program offered college students free flight instruction in exchange for a commitment that remained deliberately vague about future military service. For young men like Cheli, it represented adventure without immediate obligation, a chance to fly without fully acknowledging what that skill might soon be required for. He earned his private pilot's license in 1940. The certificate represented perhaps 40 hours of flight time in light aircraft, enough to understand the basics of lift and drag, of coordinated turns and power management, of the peculiar way the world looks when viewed from above. It was not combat training. It was not even particularly advanced civilian instruction. But it was enough to mark him as a candidate when the military began its frantic expansion after Pearl Harbor. Cheli enlisted in the Army Air Forces in early 1942, one of thousands of young men suddenly discovering that their recreational flying skills had become military assets. He was older than many of the other aviation cadets, 23 years old with a college education and civilian flight experience, factors that accelerated his path through the training pipeline. The USAAF needed pilots desperately, and men who arrived already knowing which pedal controlled which rudder represented compressed timelines and reduced washout rates. His training took him through the standard progression of the period: primary in light aircraft to verify basic aptitude, basic in heavier trainers to introduce military procedures and instrument flight, advanced to refine the skills that would matter in combat. Somewhere in this sequence, the decision was made to track him toward multi-engine aircraft rather than fighters. The selection criteria remain opaque across 8 decades, but the outcome was clear. Ralph Cheli would fly bombers. The B-25. Mitchell was not the most glamorous aircraft in the Army Air Force's inventory, but it may have been among the most versatile. Originally designed as a conventional medium bomber, the aircraft had proven adaptable to roles its creators had never imagined. The Mitchell could bomb from high altitude with reasonable accuracy. It could attack shipping at masthead height with devastating effect. It could strafe ground targets with forward-firing guns. It could serve as a transport, a reconnaissance platform, a trainer. Its twin engines provided redundancy that single-engine aircraft lacked. Its tricycle landing gear made it forgiving on the ground. Its relatively modest size allowed operation from airfields that would have swallowed a B-17 or B-24. For operations in the Southwest Pacific, the B-25 had been transformed into something approaching a flying gunship. The glass bombardier nose was replaced with sheet metal, and machine guns, as many as 850 caliber weapons pointed forward, their combined firepower capable of shredding aircraft on the ground or punching through the thin hulls of Japanese cargo vessels. The modification traded precision bombing capability for devastating strafing potential, a trade that made sense against targets at treetop level, but demanded an entirely different approach to combat. Cheli learned to fly this weapon in the months before deployment, mastering the particular challenges of low-altitude attack. The compression of time that came with high speed near the ground, the need to begin firing runs from distances measured in seconds rather than minutes, the unforgiving consequences of any miscalculation when terrain offered no margin for error. By mid-1943, he was in New Guinea, assigned to the 38th Bombardment Group, part of the 5th Air Force's growing campaign against Japanese positions across the Southwest Pacific. The 38th flew out of airfields carved from the jungle, strips of crushed coral and packed earth that turned to mud in the rains and dust in the heat, places where aircraft maintenance was a constant battle against tropical humidity and where malaria claimed nearly as many men as combat. Cheli arrived not as a novice, but as an officer with demonstrated competence, the kind of pilot who other pilots watched during briefings to gauge the difficulty of an assigned mission. He flew his early combat missions as a wingman, learning the specific dangers of the theater, learning which anti-aircraft positions were most active, learning the approach angles that offered the best chance of survival against a particular target. He flew without incident, without drama, without the kind of spectacular actions that generate immediate recognition. His reputation grew through accumulation rather than single events. Mission after mission completed successfully. Formation discipline maintained under fire. Targets hit, aircraft returned, crews brought home. In a theater where attrition was measured in weekly percentages, consistency was its own form of excellence. By August 1943, Ralph Cheli was a squadron commander within the 38th Bombardment Group, responsible not merely for his own aircraft, but for the 16 pilots and crews who flew under his leadership. The promotion reflected not just his flying ability, but his capacity to manage the human complexities of combat aviation, the scheduling of missions, the assessment of pilot fatigue, the maintenance of morale in an environment where friends disappeared with terrible regularity. He was 24 years old. The missions that preceded August 18, 1943, established patterns that would matter when patterns failed. Cheli's approach to combat flying was notably conservative by the standards of his theater and his time. In an environment that often rewarded aggression, that celebrated pilots who pressed attacks to the edge of recklessness, he maintained a discipline that some mistook for timidity until they watched him perform under fire. The B-25 operations against Japanese positions in New Guinea followed a tactical evolution that had been written in the blood of earlier crews. The first attempts at conventional medium-altitude bombing had proven costly and ineffective. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses were concentrated and accurate. Fighter interception was aggressive, and the dispersed, camouflaged nature of targets like airfield revetments made them difficult to hit from 10,000 feet even under ideal conditions. The solution that emerged was skip bombing and low-level strafing, techniques that inverted the traditional relationship between aircraft and target. Instead of approaching from above, where defenders had time to track and engage, the B-25s came in at treetop level, using terrain and speed to compress the engagement window. Against shipping, they literally skipped bombs across the water like stones, the weapons striking hulls at or below the waterline where armor was thinnest. Against ground targets, they flew directly over positions at altitudes measured in tens of feet, guns blazing, bombs releasing at the last possible moment. The tactics were effective. They were also unforgiving of error. At 200 miles per hour and 50 feet of altitude, a pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to react to any unexpected obstacle. A momentary loss of attention meant a wing through the trees. A miscalculated pull-up meant contact with rising terrain. The missions demanded absolute focus from takeoff to landing, concentration sustained over hours of flight through hostile airspace. Cheli managed this stress through preparation rather than bravado. Before each mission, he studied the target materials with unusual intensity, memorizing the position of known anti-aircraft sites, the orientation of runways, the likely locations of dispersed aircraft. He flew approach routes in his mind before flying them in his aircraft, visualizing the sequence of turns and altitude changes that would deliver his squadron to the target. In the air, he maintained formation position with precision that other pilots noted and occasionally resented. The B-25s flew close enough that wingtip vortices from one aircraft could disturb the flight path of another, close enough that a sudden maneuver by the leader would propagate through the formation like a wave. This proximity was intentional. Massed aircraft meant massed firepower, and concentrated attacks overwhelmed point defenses that could have picked off scattered individuals. But close formation also meant absolute reliance on the leader's judgment. If the lead aircraft made a mistake, every following aircraft was likely to repeat it. If the leader flew into a trap, the entire formation flew with him. The responsibility was not abstract but geometric, a matter of sight lines and reaction times that left no room for independent decision-making once the attack run began. Cheli's previous missions had tested this responsibility without breaking it. He had led formations through anti-aircraft fire that damaged aircraft but did not destroy them. He had pressed attacks against targets that proved more heavily defended than intelligence had suggested. He had brought his squadron home through weather that reduced visibility to hundreds of yards and made navigation an exercise in dead reckoning and faith. In each case, his decisions had followed a particular logic. Assess the threat, calculate the probability of success against the cost of failure, commit fully or abort completely. There was no partial commitment in low-level attack. Once the run began, it continued until ordnance was expended or the aircraft was destroyed. The only decision point was before the run started. This calculus had served him well through the spring and summer of 1943. His squadron had suffered losses, inevitable in the kind of operations they flew, but the losses had been proportionate to the targets destroyed. The exchange ratio, measured in the cold accounting of war, had been acceptable. More importantly, from Cheli's perspective, the losses had not been caused by failures of judgment or discipline that might have been avoided. He carried the weight of command in ways that were visible only to those who knew what to look for. The extra hours spent on mission planning, the walks he took alone after briefings, working through scenarios that might arise, the attention he paid to his crew's welfare, ensuring that the men who flew with him had adequate rest, adequate food, adequate equipment for the missions ahead. His fellow officers noted his quietness, his reluctance to join the loud camaraderie that helped other men cope with the constant presence of death. Cheli was not withdrawn, not unfriendly, but he maintained a separation that some interpreted as aloofness. In retrospect, it appears more likely that he simply understood the mathematics of his situation too clearly to pretend otherwise. In the Southwest Pacific in 1943, a combat pilot's statistical life expectancy was measured in missions, not months. The 38th Bombardment Group had lost aircraft and crews at rates that would have been considered catastrophic in any other context. Every pilot who flew those missions understood at some level that the odds would eventually catch up with him. The question was not whether but when, and whether the manner of the catching would serve some purpose beyond the pilot's personal fate. Cheli flew as if the answer to that question mattered more than the question itself. August 18, 1943, began in darkness at an airfield that the jungle was constantly trying to reclaim. The briefing had come hours before dawn, pilots assembled in a structure that was part tent and part salvaged timber, the air thick with humidity and cigarette smoke. The target was the WWII airfield complex, a concentration of Japanese air power that intelligence had identified as both a threat and an opportunity. Reconnaissance photographs showed dozens of aircraft dispersed among the 4 airfields in the area, fighters and bombers that could contest Allied operations across a vast stretch of the Southwest Pacific. The planned strike would involve multiple groups attacking simultaneously, a coordinated assault intended to catch the Japanese before they could disperse or respond. The 38th Bombardment Group would hit Dagwa Airdrome, one of the most heavily developed strips in the complex. Cheli would lead one of the squadrons, taking his B-25s in at low altitude against the parked aircraft and support facilities. The intelligence estimates were sobering. Japanese fighters were based at the target fields. Anti-aircraft positions had been identified from previous reconnaissance, though the possibility of additional weapons remained. The approach would take the formation over water for much of the route, reducing the navigational challenges but offering no terrain masking against defending fighters. Surprise was hoped for, but not assumed. Cheli's aircraft was loaded with parachute fragmentation bombs and full ammunition for the forward guns. The fuel tanks were topped to maximum, giving the range needed for the mission plus reserve for the unexpected. The right engines had been run up and checked, the propellers cycled, the control surfaces verified. The aircraft was as ready as the maintenance crews could make it. The takeoff was uneventful, the B-25 lifting off the coral strip in the pre-dawn darkness, climbing to cruise altitude for the transit to the target area. The formation assembled over a predetermined point, each aircraft finding its place in the combat box, navigation lights blinking in the darkness until the sun began to lighten the eastern horizon. The flight toward WWII covered several hundred miles of ocean, the aircraft maintaining formation through the transition from darkness to daylight, the crews settling into the particular tedium of extended overwater flight. The tension would come later. For now, there was only the drone of engines and the endless blue beneath them. Approximately 30 miles from the coast of New Guinea, the situation began to change. The formation descended toward attack altitude, trading the relative safety of height for the tactical advantage of terrain masking. At 300 feet, the aircraft were below the effective engagement envelope of most Japanese radar systems. At 100 feet, they would be difficult to track visually until they were nearly on top of their targets. The descent was the point where the mathematics of the mission shifted irrevocably. Above 5,000 feet, a damaged aircraft had options. Below 500 feet, options disappeared with altitude. Every foot of descent closed possible escape routes, committed crews to outcomes that could not be revised. Cheli's aircraft reached attack altitude with the formation intact. The squadron maintaining position as the coastline of New Guinea became visible on the horizon. The target was now minutes away. The anti-aircraft positions would begin engaging as soon as the aircraft were identified. The fighters, if airborne, would be vectoring toward the approaching formation. The first indication of trouble came from the sky rather than the ground. Japanese fighters had been scrambled, either in response to radar detection of the incoming strike or as part of standing patrols that happened to intercept the American formation. The details of the interception remain unclear across 8 decades, but the outcome was not. Enemy aircraft were above and behind the B-25s as they began their final approach to Dagwa. The escort situation was equally uncertain. American fighters had been assigned to protect the bombers, but the coordination of large strikes over the Southwest Pacific was imprecise at best. Whether the escorts were present in strength, whether they had engaged the Japanese fighters, whether they had been drawn away by diversionary attacks, these questions cannot be answered definitively from the surviving records. What is clear is that Cheli's formation was under attack from multiple directions as it approached the target. Fighters dove on the B-25s from above. Anti-aircraft fire rose from positions around the airfield. The aircraft were caught in a convergence of threats that left no direction safe, no maneuver unexposed. The fire started somewhere in this chaos. Ground fire, fighter attack, or mechanical failure triggered by combat damage. The specific cause was never established. What witnesses observed was flame erupting from the left engine nacelle of the lead B-25, smoke streaming backward, the aircraft continuing its attack, heading as if nothing had changed. The formation was now less than 5 miles from the target. Less than 90 seconds of flight time. Less than 90 seconds to decide what the fire meant and what to do about it. Cheli's aircraft was no longer a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a deadline, a diminishing calculation of fuel, structure, and time. The fire created a decision tree that doctrine had never anticipated. A burning aircraft at low altitude should climb. This was fundamental, written into every emergency procedure, reinforced by every instructor who had ever taught a student the hierarchy of aviation priorities. Maintain aircraft control, analyze the situation, take appropriate action. Climbing bought time. Climbing bought options. Climbing bought the altitude necessary for bailout if the fire could not be controlled. But climbing meant abandoning the attack run. Climbing meant pulling out of formation, disrupting the careful geometry of the squadron, leaving the following aircraft without a visual reference for the final approach. Climbing meant survival, but survival purchased at the cost of mission completion. The fire was not hypothetical. Witnesses in following aircraft could see the flames clearly, the orange-red stream of burning fuel or hydraulic fluid trailing from the nacelle, the smoke marking Cheli's position against the morning sky. The damage was progressive. Whatever was burning would continue to burn, would spread, would eventually reach fuel tanks or control linkages or structural elements that could not survive the heat. Cheli held course. The decision was visible in the aircraft's flight path. The unwavering heading toward Dagwa, the steady altitude maintained at perhaps 200 feet above the water. The following pilots could see their leader flying directly into the target area in an aircraft that was actively consuming itself, and they could do nothing but follow. This was the architecture of low-level attack, made brutally explicit. The formation depended on the leader. The leader was burning. And still, the formation flew forward because there was no other option that preserved the mission. The airfield approached at a rate that compressed time into heartbeats. At over 200 miles per hour, 5 miles became 4, became 3, became 2. The anti-aircraft fire intensified as the aircraft entered the engagement envelope of the lighter automatic weapons, tracers rising in arcs that pilots had to fly through rather than around. The Japanese fighters made passes, their attacks degraded by the low altitude and the crossing angles, but still dangerous, still adding to the cumulative threat. Inside the burning B-25, circumstances that cannot be precisely reconstructed were unfolding. The cockpit of a Mitchell was not large. The pilot sat on the left, the co-pilot on the right, with flight instruments, engine gauges, and navigation equipment crowded into every available space. A fire in the left nacelle would have been visible through the pilot's side window, the flames likely reflecting off the cowling and wing surface, the smoke occasionally obscuring forward visibility. The crew would have been aware of their situation. The radio man, the turret gunner, each would have seen or smelled or felt the evidence of the fire, would have understood what it meant for their chances of survival. Whether there were discussions of bailout, whether there were arguments about continuing the attack, whether there was simply silence, these things are lost to history. What is documented is the aircraft's flight path. The lead B-25 continued toward Dagwa, maintaining the heading and altitude necessary for the attack run, the formation following in the discipline that Cheli had established through months of training and dozens of missions. The target area came into visual range, the dispersal areas where Japanese aircraft were parked, the revetments that provided protection against bombing from altitude, the support buildings and fuel storage facilities that sustained the enemy's air operations. All of it spread beneath the approaching formation like a map becoming reality. Cheli's aircraft was first over the target. The forward guns fired, the .50 caliber weapons hammering out rounds at rates that emptied ammunition boxes in seconds. The bombs released, parafrag clusters separating and descending on parachutes designed to give the aircraft time to clear the blast area. The squadron followed, each aircraft adding its firepower to the attack, the cumulative effect of massed weapons tearing into the prepared positions. The fire continued to burn. A pilot in formation could maintain an attack run for perhaps 30 to 45 seconds at these altitudes and speeds. Longer than that invited disaster from cumulative damage, from anti-aircraft fire that improved its aim with each passing moment, from the statistical certainty that eventually a round would find something vital. The attack was by necessity brief, violent, and total. Cheli held the formation through the run. The squadron stayed together, maintained its discipline, completed its assigned task. The bombs fell. The guns fired. The targets were struck. And then the lead aircraft peeled away. Witnesses described the maneuver as deliberate, a controlled break from the formation that took the burning B-25 away from the other aircraft. Whether Cheli handed off leadership explicitly, whether the separation was simply understood through the visual evidence of his aircraft's condition, the result was the same. The squadron continued its withdrawal while the burning Mitchell diverged toward the sea. The aircraft was no longer capable of sustained flight. The fire had spread, the damage accumulating beyond what field repair could address. The choices had narrowed to two: crash on land or ditch in the water. Cheli turned toward the water. The ditching of a B-25 was a procedure practiced in theory and feared in reality. The aircraft was not designed for water landings. The tricycle landing gear created catching points that could flip the aircraft on contact. The nose, packed with guns and ammunition rather than the designed bombardier position, changed the weight distribution in ways that affected handling during the approach to the surface. What happened next is known only in outline. The B-25 came down in the sea somewhere north of WWII, the aircraft surviving the initial impact sufficiently intact that at least some of the crew escaped the wreckage. Cheli was among the survivors. He was subsequently captured by Japanese forces. The attack on Dagwa continued as his aircraft sank. The strike against the WWII complex on August 18, 1943, achieved results that validated the cost. Multiple Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground, exact counts varying by report, but measured in dozens rather than single digits. Support facilities were damaged. The defensive capability of the airfield complex was degraded for a period that allowed subsequent operations to proceed with reduced opposition. The strategic objective of the mission, the suppression of Japanese air power in the region, was advanced. The formation that Cheli led completed its assigned task. The aircraft that followed his burning Mitchell through the attack delivered their ordnance and returned to base. The discipline he had maintained until the final moments of his controlled flight allowed the squadron to function as a unit rather than fragmenting into individual aircraft, making individual decisions against consolidated defenses. The cost accounting was recorded in after-action reports filed in the days following the mission. Aircraft lost, crews missing, damage sustained by aircraft that returned. The reports were written in the flat language of military documentation, numbers and designations arranged in columns that conveyed loss without emotion. Cheli's name appeared among the missing. His aircraft, last observed descending toward the water, was not recovered. His crew was not rescued. The assumption in the immediate aftermath was that all aboard had been killed in the crash or subsequent ditching. This assumption proved incorrect, though the correction brought no comfort. Japanese records and post-war investigations established that Cheli survived the water landing and was captured by enemy forces. He was transported to a prisoner-of-war facility, joining hundreds of other American and Allied airmen held in captivity across the Pacific theater. He died in Japanese custody in March 1944, approximately 7 months after his capture. The circumstances of his death were never fully established. Japanese prisoner records from the period were incomplete, deliberately destroyed in some cases as the war turned against the empire. What is known is that he did not survive captivity, that the wounds or illness or treatment he received proved fatal, that the man who had refused to abandon his squadron over Dagwa never returned home. The squadron he had led continued operations without him. New pilots arrived to replace those lost. New missions were flown against new targets. The war in the Southwest Pacific ground forward through 1943 and 1944, the chain of islands that led toward Japan, falling one by one to American advances. The men who had watched Cheli's aircraft burn over Dagwa carried their memories forward into subsequent missions. Some of them survived the war. Some did not. Those who lived told stories that eventually reached official channels, accounts of what their squadron commander had done in the minutes when his aircraft became a pyre. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously, the announcement coming after the war's end, when the full circumstances of Cheli's death had been established. The citation described his actions in the language appropriate to the nation's highest military honor, formal phrases that conveyed the essential facts while necessarily omitting the chaos, the fear, the moment-by-moment calculations that had produced them. The citation noted that his aircraft had been hit by enemy fire and set ablaze. It noted that he had continued the attack despite the fire. It noted that his actions had ensured the success of the mission and the safety of other aircraft in his formation. It concluded with the observation that he had demonstrated conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. What the citation could not convey was the specific quality of the decision itself. Cheli was not a man who had acted without understanding his circumstances. He had been flying combat missions for months. He knew what fire meant for an aircraft at low altitude. He knew the statistical likelihood of survival for a burning bomber over enemy territory. He knew that his crew would share whatever fate he chose, and he knew what would happen to his squadron if he broke off the attack run in the final minutes before the target. The decision to continue was not instinctive. It was calculated, a weighing of probabilities that most men would never be asked to perform, and that almost no one would perform the way he did. The mathematics of his situation were clear. His aircraft was likely lost regardless of what he did next. The question was whether its loss would mean anything beyond his own death. He chose to make it mean something. The formation held. The attack succeeded. The squadron survived. These outcomes were not guaranteed by his decision, but they were enabled by it. Without the reference point of his aircraft, without the stability of a leader maintaining course, through the final seconds of the approach, the squadron would have faced the target area as individuals rather than as a coordinated force. What individual aircraft might have done in that circumstance? How many might have pressed their attacks? How many might have broken off or scattered? These are questions that cannot be answered because Cheli ensured they never had to be asked. The official language of the Medal of Honor citation exists at a particular distance from the reality it describes. The citation for Major Ralph Cheli reads, in the stilted cadence of military prose, that he led his squadron in an attack against a strongly defended Japanese airdrome. It notes that his aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire and burst into flames. It observes that despite the damage and the certain knowledge that his flaming aircraft could not survive, he continued the attack, personally leading his squadron into the target area. It concludes that his intrepid leadership resulted in the complete success of the mission. The words are accurate. They are also insufficient. What the citation cannot capture is the silence in the cockpit of a burning aircraft, the smell of burning fuel and hydraulic fluid, the heat beginning to penetrate the thin aluminum skin, the knowledge that every second of continued flight was a second closer to structural failure or explosion. What the citation cannot describe is the view from the following aircraft, the pilots watching their leader fly forward in a machine that was visibly dying, knowing they had to follow because the formation demanded it, knowing that if he could continue, they had no excuse to falter. What the citation cannot convey is the particular nature of courage when it is expressed not as a moment of violence or defiance, but as sustained, deliberate action in full knowledge of consequences. Ralph Cheli did not survive to explain his decision. He did not write memoirs or give interviews or stand at reunions describing what he had thought in those final moments over Dagwa. Whatever internal process led him to continue the attack died with him in a Japanese prisoner camp. One more piece of individual history erased by war's indifferent accounting. What remains is the evidence of his actions themselves. He was a man who had trained carefully, who had led methodically, who had survived through discipline rather than luck. When the moment came that required something beyond discipline, he did not hesitate. The fire was real, the danger was real, and the responsibility he felt toward the men flying behind him was real enough to override the most fundamental human instinct. The mission succeeded. The squadron came home. These facts are documented in reports that have survived 8 decades of filing and archiving and historical attention. They are the measurable outcomes of what happened over Dagua on August 18, 1943. But the unmeasurable outcome is something else. Somewhere in the calculus of that morning, a man decided that his life was worth less than his responsibility. Not in the abstract sense that soldiers often invoke, the general willingness to face danger for cause or country, but in the specific, immediate, mathematical sense of a pilot with altitude to climb and speed to escape, who chose instead to fly straight into a target that was trying to kill him. The fire did not change his decision. The fire was simply the cost of the decision, a cost he paid because the alternative was abandoning men who had followed him through dozens of missions and who would have to follow whoever replaced him through dozens more. Ralph Cheli was 24 years old when he disappeared over the Bismarck Sea. He was 25 when he died in captivity. The span between those dates was 7 months of imprisonment about which almost nothing is known, 7 months during which a man who had commanded a squadron waited in a camp for a fate he could not influence. The Medal of Honor arrived years after his death, a piece of metal and ribbon that his family received in a ceremony he never witnessed. The citation was read into the record, the official language becoming part of the permanent documentation of American military valor. The B-25 Mitchell remained in service through the end of the war and beyond, the aircraft type that had carried Cheli through his final mission continuing to carry other men through other missions until better aircraft replaced it. The Southwest Pacific Campaign continued until Japan's surrender, the string of islands and atolls that Cheli had helped contest falling one by one until there were no more islands left to take. The war ended. The histories were written. The names of the dead were carved into monuments and printed in books and gradually forgotten by everyone except the families who had lost them. But somewhere in the structure of military aviation, in the unspoken understanding that pilots share about what the profession demands, the essence of what Cheli did persists. Formation discipline is not merely a technique, it is a covenant, an agreement among pilots that the success of the mission depends on each individual maintaining position regardless of personal circumstance. When Cheli continued his attack in a burning aircraft, he was fulfilling that covenant at its most extreme interpretation, demonstrating that the formation mattered more than the individual even when the individual was on fire. The pilots who survived the war and went on to fly in Korea and Vietnam and the conflicts that followed carried this understanding forward. They did not need to know Cheli's name to know what his example meant. The principle was embedded in their training, in their culture, in the wordless communication that passed between pilots who had flown combat together. Hold the line, complete the run, bring your wingmen home. These imperatives exist because men like Ralph Cheli demonstrated they were possible, not easy, not survivable, but possible. The B-25 that burned over Dagwa was never recovered. Its wreckage lies somewhere beneath the waters north of New Guinea, mixed with the remains of other aircraft from both sides, part of the vast underwater cemetery that the Pacific War created across thousands of miles of ocean. Cheli's name appears on memorials in places he never saw, carved into stone by people who never knew him, maintained by institutions that exist to ensure such names are not forgotten. But the truest memorial is something less tangible. Every time a pilot faces a decision between personal safety and mission completion, every time the mathematics of survival conflict with the geometry of tactical necessity, the question that Cheli answered hangs in the air. What is the mission worth? What is the formation worth? What are the men behind you worth? On August 18, 1943, one pilot provided an answer. The answer cost him everything. It gave his squadron everything they needed.